Viljar and Gayatri, welcome to the Penguin studio.
Thank you.
Good to have you here. Maybe we could start with a round of introductions. Viljar, would you like to start? Say a bit about yourself?
Sure. Thank you for having me here. My name is Viljar Haavik. I'm a PhD fellow at the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs, NUPI, here in Oslo. My research, I've previously focused on conflict and violent extremism, working in the Sahel region of West Africa, Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso. And then for the past 4 years, I've been doing my PhD, which is on what taxation can tell us about state-society relations and what it cannot tell us about it in Mali and Liberia in West Africa. Mm. So yeah, and mainly do qualitative fieldwork. So I do go to field trips to both countries to do my research. Yeah.
All right. Interesting. Gayatri, could you just introduce yourself quickly?
Sure, thank you. And thank you for this opportunity. So I'm Gayatri, and I'm a postdoctoral researcher at CMI and in Bergen. And my research focuses quite similarly on the political economy of taxation in fragile states. And I work a lot on Somalia, increasingly now on DRC, and I have previous experience in Kenya, Tanzania, Ethiopia, and Afghanistan.
Great. Maybe we can start with this relationship between taxation and state building. Can you outline sort of the traditional links, how it's usually seen, Viljar?
Sure. It's first of all, it's a very, very basic link between state building and taxation, which is that most things the state do requires money, it requires resources for it to provide security, safety, justice, education. And taxation and customs is the main way to finance this. So, but there's a lot of different research that goes in a lot of different directions with taxation and state building, but within different disciplines, history, political science, anthropology. But some of the more famous work comes from history, when you look into state formation, how the modern states that we have today came about. And here we, for example, have a guy called Charles Tilly, who came with the famous, not slogan, but saying war made states and the state made war, which basically tries to argue that waging war required taxation, it required resources, which in turn required a stronger bureaucracy, a more professional bureaucracy that could collect the necessary resources to wage war, which was necessary to survive. Then another famous historian, which is lies behind a lot of some of the theories that we may talk about today, is a woman called Margaret Levi. She wrote a book called Of Rule and Revenue, which argued that looked at England in the 17th and 18th century with the relationship between the king and the elites in English society, the parliament in particular, and so that tax collection, if the king wanted to collect more taxes, he had to bargain with the elites in society. And from this bargaining, the ruler had to make concessions, and from this you get the foundations for the democratic institutions that later came about in Britain. So taxation is not just revenue making, getting the necessary resources, it's also politics and something that feeds into the other institutions of state and society.
Is that from where this famous kind of quote in the tax world of like no taxation without representation? Is that from this type of work in the UK?
Yeah, it's very much like that. And the point is, from Levi actually, it's very much like the American Revolution then. They told the king no taxation without representation. So that's one way it can go through bargaining.
So yeah. One concept that we use a lot in this, that is used a lot in this literature, is the fiscal social contract. Could you explain what that means?
Sure. It's also this is part of the political science or modern political science and economy, where you have this fiscal theory of state formation that try to say that even though after the World War you don't have the threat of interstate war that much, of course you have Russia, Ukraine, but for most countries there's no existential threat anymore, but they still have to make revenue. So they say that what kind of revenue the state collects, that has something to say for what kind of relationship you get between state and society and what kind of government type. The basic distinction is between unearned and earned revenue. Unearned, it's natural resource, rents, aid, military support, that those kinds of rent type of income. Then you have earned income. That's the direct taxes on people's salaries, corporate profits, which are harder to collect, but compared to unearned revenue, the state then becomes dependent on its population for its revenue. So it has incentives to increase the prosperity of its population, have a better business environment, etc., and which means it feeds into other areas of public services, public goods. So then, here you have the basic idea of the fiscal contract, which is that taxation is not just a technical matter, but it's central to how political power, the power to compel someone to do something, how that power becomes legitimate, how it becomes authority. So then the basic idea is that taxation it leads to bargaining between state and society. If people pay taxes, they are more inclined to demand something in return from the state. Hence a social contract. A social contract is a transaction. I give away some of my liberty in return for the state providing me services and goods, and I pay taxes and do military service and those kinds of things. And this is a very influential idea, especially for economists and political scientists, to look at how a state-society relationship works. If you have a strong fiscal contract, it's usually characterized by the liberal democracy is sort of the golden standard within fiscal contract theory. You have representative institutions, good public services, goods, a welfare state, and tax collection is at least semi-voluntary. It's sort of like a habit. Yeah.
Is the fiscal part of the contract, is that tax?
Yeah.
Like earned income mostly?
Yeah, it can be taxation on earned income. It's the earned revenue. It's the direct taxes. Those are the ones that's supposed to stimulate this. Yeah. If you only rely on a few mining companies or oil companies, then there's a greater chance statistically from statistical research that the type of government will be more authoritarian. Okay. The mechanism is that the government doesn't rely on most of its population and only relies on a few, perhaps foreign companies. Yeah.
I was just thinking about what you said by the end there, that it kind of also creates in liberal democracies, there's kind of a willingness to pay tax. Does any one of you want to say a little bit about this kind of element of trust or tax morale as well that plays into this more traditional or liberal democracy model of the fiscal social contract?
Yeah, I can jump in a little bit. So I think picking up on Viljar's comment about, Margaret Levi also talked about what she specifically mentioned a lot was this quasi. The idea is that when we pay taxes, of course, the state can coercively ask us to pay taxes and enforce compliance. But most of the time, we actually pay taxes without that compliance, without actually being audited at that level. So it's quasi-voluntary compliance. And what she meant by that is this idea that why do we sort of pay? So the state has to sort of influence us to pay taxes in a way in which we kind of want to also pay taxes. And so this is the revenue bargaining that he was kind of talking about, is that if we have, if people, so the traditional theory says that, if people are represented, they're given certain public goods and services, and there's a level of accountability of the government, then people are more likely to be compliant to pay taxes. So there are lots of things that go into, enforcement is one part of it, but it's really, the idea is that it's the exchange that's really important in upholding this fiscal contract. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Can I add one thing?
For it.
Yeah. It's also that, say we often get into the vertical trust between state and citizen. Citizens are trust towards the state that it will provide in return for the taxes that you pay. At the same time, it will try and punish you if you try to evade taxes. But there is, and if in Norway, I remember when we were at a conference in Bergen 2 years ago. Now we're having a new conference in a few weeks here in Oslo. Then in Bergen there was a representative from the tax authority who said that Norwegians have too much trust in the tax authority. When the tax returns come, then so many people don't check it. They just trust that the information is right, but you can't trust them that much. They can make mistakes. So that's the vertical trust. But then this voluntary side of taxation, if the Norwegian state, for example, tax authority would say that, okay, we're not going to coerce people anymore, not going to punish, we're just going to give you a lot of benefits if you pay taxes, then hypothetically, I would think that the tax system would collapse in a few weeks, because then you do away with all horizontal trust between citizens.
Yeah.
If there's no risk that my neighbor will not be punished for not paying taxes, then I will start suspecting everyone else of cheating on the taxes, and I would be the fool losing out paying taxes only voluntary. So hence the quasi-voluntary thing is very, very important. There should be a lot of incentives to pay tax, but there always needs to be a whip in the background for it to work. Yeah.
That's really interesting. So in this episode, we wanted to focus kind of on how this paradigm that you guys have outlined now might not always look the same when you go beyond the liberal democracy or the Western kind of context. And specifically, we wanted to focus on the link between state building and taxation in fragile states. Gayatri, do you want to kind of outline this picture, how these paradigms are maybe challenged, and even just define what is a fragile state in this context?
Yeah. So I think the fragile state is like this concept which has been doing the rounds. I think in terms of like the World Bank defines it as fragile and conflict-affected states. There's a fragility state index which measures these states on a number of indicators, but very broadly, and I think more in terms of how we kind of identify it on a day-to-day basis, or more colloquially, it's this idea that these states generally don't fit the conception of like a state which generally lacks monopoly over coercion. So as like we were just talking about, this enforcement capacity is actually quite weak. States can't enforce compliance most of the time. They don't even have the monopoly over violence. And so for monopoly over violence is this idea that states, the reason why they can enforce is because the state is the only one with the whip, so to speak. Right? So then what happens in these contexts? And then it's also the issue is that state capacity is weak in a lot of ways, and there are different conceptions of capacity, but one of the basic and ways in which you can assess it is the state able to deliver basic goods and services. And like basic goods is normally we talk about like basic public goods and services, and these include like from roads to security to contract enforcement to education, and the list is broad. And then I think the other issue is that is the state even representative and legitimate? Because again, a lot of things have gotten tagged on to this idea of the contract, right? So the contract is upheld if citizens are represented, if states are accountable, if states are also considered to be legitimate actors and they're representing our interests as such. So all of these sort of dynamics don't really quite hold up in these contexts. And, I study Somalia, and that kind of like has been this paradigmatic case of state failure because it underwent like sort of almost 26 years of statelessness. And by that, I mean, it lacked a formal state.
Yeah.
I think that would be what. And so I can elaborate further on this, but I don't know if you had a particular question in between.
Yeah, no, so what you're outlining is kind of a situation where there's no real kind of institutions, enforcement, or even a sufficient provision of the goods or of the safety that you're expecting in return for your taxes. And even in the most extreme cases, the state authority isn't considered legitimate. Like it isn't considered something that represents your interests or will even serve you. So how does this idea of the fiscal social contract fit into this? Like how does that look in this type of context?
Yeah, and so I think that's a really important and challenging question, because I think what happens is that we get really attached to this idea of the state. Firstly, I think this idea of the state kind of needs to be unraveled a little bit, because even the social contract theory upholds this version of this very, it draws a lot on the Western experience. Two, the state idea itself is very much of a idea of this. It's this idea, this very fanciful idea almost, which doesn't actually hold up in a lot of contexts, which is this idea that the state has this monopoly over violence.
Yeah.
And many would argue, in fact, that's something to be proven and to be theorized rather than to be assumed. And the other idea is that, states are coherent entities. So there's this idea that there's this, and a lot of theorists have talked about, Abrams and others, and have talked about this distinction basically that we need to make between what we understand the state to be and what we experience the state to be. So those two things are quite different. So when we say something about the Norwegian state, are we talking about the state as it is, or is it the bureaucrat that we have specifically spoken to and we've interacted with, say, this tax authority, versus let's say this idea of Norwegian state that we all want to uphold as this liberal democratic ideal. So there are two different things. And then this other idea that we have is that the state is very separate from society, and then this autonomy idea is also quite prevalent. And what that means is that it prevents us from seeing the ways in which states legitimize themselves. And all of this actually has tax implications. So picking up on this last point. So if we think of the state as being, quite autonomous from society, we fail to see that a lot of the time states, in fact, interact with several types of tax collecting authorities. So these include, religious authorities, for instance, have been collecting teeths for ages. Now, how does that interact with formal taxes? In a lot of cases, people are like, well, we can pay to the religious authorities because we get some returns, maybe not in this life, maybe in the next life, who knows? But we don't really want to contribute towards the state because we don't get those kinds of returns from them. And a lot of times, so there is some competition from multiple authorities, but a lot of times they can also work to legitimize state authorities. So sometimes these, what we call hybrid arrangements, emerge where states actually work with local informal tax collectors to collect taxes. But in a lot of cases, there are a lot of terrorist groups, for instance, will collect taxes and extort taxes, and a lot of the times it undermines state authority. So these dynamics need to be borne in mind and impact this larger contract. And so it means that there is actually a mediation between the idea of what we see as the contract being just between state and citizens, and in fact, it may be between states, citizens, and these informal actors as well. And then I think this idea that, this coherency of the state, sometimes we want this idea of the state being upheld versus, so in my research, for instance, I find sometimes that this idea of the state becomes very important, especially because it offers certain legitimacy. So even being in a stateless disorder is from an outside perspective, a stateless disorder, is not actually a great place to be. Even if you are governed by different kinds of rules. So this idea of the state gets upheld a lot of the times. In fact, these informal tax authorities will legitimize themselves by claiming stateness in a lot of ways as well. So there are lots of different types of exchanges that are possible. And this, I think, as I said earlier, this idea that, the coercive capacity is actually a monopoly of the state, and that's actually false in a lot of cases. And in fact, the state has to prove itself. And there are parts of the country which may be fairly autonomous, even in very, very, in very strong states that you might think of as very strong states. And so how does that play out? Yeah, so I'm gonna pause there.
Yeah.
Do you recognize some of these reflections from Gayatri in your own work, Viljar? You've worked mostly in Mali and Liberia with your PhD, right? Could you tell us a bit about what taxation can and cannot tell us about the relationship between state and society in these contexts?
Yes, there are quite a few similarities. If we start with Liberia, then it has been put in the same category as Somalia, especially in the 90s and 2000s when it had a couple of civil wars. So Liberia also has the features of a fragile state, features of a weak fiscal contract with low income, high inequality, large informal sector, lack of services, and these kinds of things. But it's interesting when you go down to the local level and you interview people about taxes and what kind of information you get out of it. So my research focused on a decentralization process in Liberia that's been going on since they enacted a new framework in 2018. Liberia's traditionally been a really over-centralized state. Liberians call it an imperial presidency. It's a very weak state, but all the power in the state is concentrated in the presidency, who controls much of the state budget, appoints more than 2,000 officials from the minister at the top to mayors down at the local level. So there's no local elections here.
Okay.
So this was seen as one of the causes of the civil war, and so there's been a lot of advocacy for decentralization reform. But since 2018, we're now in 2025, very little has actually happened. But there's been some small implementation projects here and there, and taxation is one of those things. And interesting thing they call 50-50 property tax pilots, which is that they do get revenue collection going at the local level. They will start collecting property taxes. 50% would stay at the regional level, which is called counties, and 50% would go to the central government. And then this is it's little revenue, doesn't have that much potential, but in Liberian context, this is the first time that revenue will not go to the capital first and then out again. And people have this saying that taxes are like goats. They go to Monrovia and they never come back. So this is it's a change of course, however symbolic. So, but when you talk with people about this, you could say, and we talk to people in two different pilot counties called Margibi and Grambassa, and then in two controlled counties we did not have these pilots. And you get some of what people thought about it with a brilliant idea, but there's very low trust here. So most people said this is an excellent idea, but tax collection is often coercive. Tax authorities will try to extort you or get bribes out of you. So there's a bit of informal bargaining element in here too. Services are poor, not everything, but there's lack of accountability and transparency. So people said, I might give this a chance for a couple of years and pay my property taxes, but if I don't see anything, and people will always point to their eyes, if I don't see any visible, tangible improvement, I'm going to stop paying property taxes again. So you can see this from Liberia, and this is a longer historical thing with Liberia, is that change is signal with different kinds of ruptures, the advent democratization after the Civil War, and decentralization in 2018. There's a long line of things where change is signal, but things revert back to the old patterns of authority. It's sort of a roundabout politics type of thing, and you see this from taxation and coercive tax collection, for example.
Can they, in the example you mentioned now, can they, when money comes in directly to the local level, can they actually spend it as they want as well? Because you mentioned that it was a very top-down system. So do they have any control over the money that is coming in directly at the local level?
Very, very little. Okay. With the new legal framework, when it's properly implemented, it's supposed to devolve and deconcentrate fiscal authority, as it's called. But they, for example, had something called a County Development Fund. That was something that was supposed to be decided on the regional level. $200,000 dispersed every year from the central government to sort of a county development board. But Liberia is a place with a lot of corruption, so people in Congress, in the lower house, the Congress, in the upper house, and the Senate, they were able to sort of capture the project management committees that would oversee what the money was spent for. When it was supposed to be spent on construction equipment and roads, it would often not happen. So there was often a story, stop me when I'm talking too long, but there was an interesting story in one county called Nimba where many people were talking about 22 yellow machines. And what are yellow machines? They're construction equipment, road construction equipment. You know, the cats.
Yeah.
The yellow, the digging machines. So that's the yellow machines.
The cats.
Yeah. So, and there was Nimba bought 22 yellow machines. And in the span of a few weeks, all of them, they worked for a while. Roads were started to be built, but then they all broke down. And when we traveled around Nimba, we saw several of these. We didn't see all 22, but we saw several of these broken down, wheels taken away. The engines were still there, which was quite a weird thing, which means that the engine must have been broken somehow. Otherwise, they would probably have been taken too. But this is one of the examples that, for example, construction equipment being bought in and then supposed to be used for development, and then it doesn't happen.
This is a lot of discussion for one anecdote, but it feels like a mystery why these cats broke down. Do they know why, or is it just?
We didn't get to speak with anyone who really knew why. But for example, we sat outside a mayor's office, just under a tin roof, and then 5 meters away from us, we had broken down one of these 22 yellow machines. So that was the context for a good interview.
Yeah.
But what we thought may happen is that Liberia, they produce a lot of palm oil, for example, and it can look a lot like engine oil. So one possibility is that the engine oil was switched out for much cheaper palm oil so that someone could sell the engine oil, and then the machines would break down quite quickly.
Yeah, but it's a mystery, unsolved.
It's a mystery unsolved.
Mystery.
Yeah.
It also sounds like a Radiohead song, like 22 yellow machines.
That's true.
But
Nice.
but the essence kind of this story is that, you know, even when there are reforms and attempts to decentralize power, kind of show that there are returns to paying taxes, as long as this effort isn't upheld over time, then there is no real, you know, trust that is built between, you know, citizen and state. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct.
Yeah.
Most people didn't pay property taxes. They were willing to give it a chance, but they fear that it wouldn't amount to very much, which would just feed into a very, very long, old historical pattern with deep entrenched patterns of inequality.
Yeah.
Especially when it comes to power, which is not impossible to change, but there are a lot of incentives and structures that work against it. And donors, they themselves, they want to try and change this, but they often fall into a sort of a trap where the state, when they cooperate with the state, they do a sort of minimum good enough job satisfying the reporting standards of donor actors, and so they can say to their own bosses that we're achieving decentralization, at least to some degree, given the context. But then things do not really change for the average Liberian citizen.
Yeah. That's really interesting, though, because it gives also a lot of insights into how to actually approach development work, you know, like in terms of, like you said, trying to actually do good work or trying to just satisfy donor reporting standards. But also in terms of how you can actually build institutions, you know, like it's not really enough for there to be an influx of money and some big plans. There needs to also be local ownership along many levels of authority for anything to actually amount for it, and especially over time. What do you think this case says in general about the development of Liberia, or the chances of development, and the state building process as well?
What you can say is that positive thing from our point of view with Liberia is that it's a democracy in it's becoming something of a relatively stable democracy in a very troubled region of Africa, you could say. It has had, since the first election in 2006, it has had 2 peaceful handovers of government between 2 opposition blocks. The last election in 2024, I think the now president won by just 0.5% or 1%, and the opponent, he just accepted the defeat and said, "I'll come back the next time."
Nice.
So, but there are Liberia is a state that's usually called neo-patrimonial in how it's run. It's a theory that it's received a lot of criticism, but if you speak to Liberian and Liberian experts themselves, they will use this term also. It's basically that you have the formal institutions of the state, but it's not within formal rules and institutions that the most important decisions are made and the resources are distributed. A lot of things happen through patronage and patron-client relation. Basically, that since the president can appoint 2,000 positions plus, it means the whole state is structured as a patronage machine because the president can reward his own loyal clients. You support me, I'll give you this position as a mayor, or so, and then you can get votes in that way. So, and that's an example of a kind of structure that you could have a good president, sort of a good emperor who wants to change the system and do things. Had an interview with a presidential candidate who said, the system should be changed, sort of easier to do development over the long term. But this person said, but I would preferably spend my 2 terms in office, 12 years, and do as much as I can with all the presidential powers that I have.
Yeah.
Problem then is it won't change, and there's too many incentives to be rewarding clients instead of distributing resources in a more productive manner for average citizens.
Yeah.
So yeah.
But in general, it shows a picture that, development is not linear. Like, you can have a relatively functioning democracy, which, according to at least traditional parameters of what is good development, is like good thing. But then there can still be other institutional factors, patronage networks that make it a different type of functioning state than what you would say, for example, Norway is. So how states look, how development look is very different across the world.
Exactly. Yeah. It's just democracy needs to deliver somehow.
Yeah.
Something else than elections. Yeah.
Right. Gayatri, you've worked a lot on the private sector in weak states. Could you talk a bit about the role of business in state building?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I just want to pick up on one thing that was mentioned. I think what's really interesting is to really, so of course, I think neo-patrimonialism, and I think you knew I was smiling, it's just it gets defined. A lot of African countries get painted with that particular brush, is that they're neo-patrimonial, which means that they do have this, that patronage politics, as was described, is the basic ways in which, power is distributed and how resources also get distributed. And that's problematic. But it's also seen as like a function. And there's a theoretical and empirical issue with neo-patrimonialism, and I'm not going to go into that. But I think the problem with all of this is that I think when we're thinking about developing countries, I think we need to understand just really how power flows and what is the nature of institutions. And I think for me, especially a better framing sometimes is like looking at this kind of as a political settlement, is like, who are the elites? And this goes back to this idea that there are lots of people with power, and how these groups sort of align and come to invest in the state, or invest in long-term institution building, let's put it, varies. And I think one of the reasons is because actually taxes are not the way in which power actually flows and how elites get benefits. So because they don't get benefits through this, it's informal institutions, which is where they get these benefits and what they call rents. So I think that's why taxation kind of plays a role. So you can't really look at just the fiscal structure as saying of the state as being the blueprint for understanding society. It has to really look at these informal institutions as also being important in helping us understand exactly how resources are getting distributed and who is making those choices and why, for instance, these CAT is not getting paid. Clearly somebody benefited. Clearly there was some kind of procurement game as well that was played, possibly, and unless it was the palm oil, which is also highly likely. I mean, I would be probably guilty of that. Confusion, no idea of kerosene. But I think going back to your question about the business, and this actually relates back, is that businesses actually, for instance, have been, one is that we we have some understanding of business compliance. But again, I think apart from like understanding profitability and understanding tax avoidance, there hasn't really been a lot of theorization about this, and especially in the African context. And that is changing, of course. And then we have much more work around this, and with several people talking about, the kinds of things that matter for compliance of businesses. And one of the big issues with all of this is that our businesses are actually interested in states, right? And this is the big development question. Like, are businesses concerned with states, or do they just want, is it what the neoliberals have been telling us for ages, to stop with all this state, just provide basic law and order and contract enforcement and just do the bare minimum. And that's all we need. And in some ways, Somalia provided this kind of really interesting case study for me, because it fits a little bit on that. Because once the state collapsed, there was no state. And so the private sector, some sectors emerged in this context. And it was the telecom sector for me, which was the most interesting, because one, it completely defies the kind of the kind of ways in which telecoms has developed across the continent, which means it's fairly Somali-led. It is not owned by an MNC, so it's not Safaricom, it's not Orange, it's not all of these other big players. It's Somalis who managed to build this network of telecom operations.
An MNC, that's a multinational company. MNC, that's a multinational company. So it's not that, it's Somali owned and run.
Yes, and of course, like there's money that's being raised from both within Somalia and outside Somalia, and I can talk a little bit about how that happened, if you like, later. But these companies emerged in this context of statelessness and this without this formal state structure. But of course, that wasn't the full story. There has been a lot of focus on identifying that, okay, so actually they developed in this context without states, but there was a lot of informal institutions which helped these companies along. So for instance, religious institutions really helped in building trust between businesses. There was kinship institutions, which were also very crucial in protecting businesses and their interests. And so all of this was possible because there were alternative institutions to formal states, which actually helped. So again, this argument is so basically cool. We don't need the state. But what I actually find is that, and for a long time, I think Somali scholars were also saying, listen, the private sector is a spoiler. They're not invested in the state. All they want is no state. And, and that's kind of the full story. But I think what I find is actually the private sector does need state. And that's a little bit about how capital accumulation happens in our current context. And I think with globalization, and of course, we are seeing some retreat on that score, but that inevitability is here. And for capital to develop and to grow, it does need some kind of formal states, because states is basically the way in which business functions. And it's how it has functioned for a very long time now, for like the last last century, for sure. And so even when we see this rise of, questioning of new capital, of neoliberalism and the fall of neoliberalism, what is replacing it is not less state. In fact, states are doubling down. And, you see Trump tumbling down. And so I think so it goes back to this idea that I think there are different ways in which states can provide certain returns. And the return is not only on the basis of public goods and services, but it may be very specific kinds of goods that businesses need. And upholding this idea of the state also has a lot of merit, because this particular way in which states help capital. So yeah, I'm going to stop there.
Great. Yeah. Could you elaborate on that, actually? Could you say a bit more about the telecom industry, maybe specifically in Somalia, and why they needed the state?
Yeah, so for me, they needed a state because so states, like if you think about it, like really like plainly, states can help with like market creation, they can help with market direction, they can help with market correction, and they can help with protecting these external interests of capital. Like that's like 4 big buckets, like kind of just a schema to think of things. And I like to think of things like this. So basically, once the state comes back, so you have like the return of the state, the empire strikes back. And nice. My one cool reference. There, I'm done. So basically, it comes. So the state sort of returns. The formal institutions are being developed a lot by the international community, like we were talking about earlier. And there's this sense that the sector is initially very hesitant because it's like, hey, we can survive, we don't need this. But actually telecoms is a highly regulated sector worldwide. So even though they were self-regulating, that regulation had its limits, especially because newer players were like, sorry, we can't really function in this context. And it goes back to who uses spectrum, and spectrum being a public good, which needs to be monitored and regulated. So to some extent, they were like, okay, we do need some regulation on that score. So that was the kind of public good. So that was for state was important for market creation. And it was also this legitimacy that it afforded them. So these are players who want to demonstrate that they're not like these kiosk mentality guys. They're not like guys who are just interested in like, doing okay in Somalia. These are people who have vision, and they're visionaries. They've developed in this context. They want to expand. And one of the major issues for them was they didn't have access to the global international system, and especially the global financial markets. So without a central bank, it's really hard to do like move money around, for instance.
Exactly.
And like that's the level I'm talking about, right? Like so when we go back to this idea, we're like, okay, so it's cool that Somalia was held up as this neoliberal like poster child, but actually it doesn't quite pan out, because at some points you do need this, and there's only a threshold beyond which. So again, regulations, access to finance was another important good that they needed. But I think essentially also there's this idea that businesses do need also the state to deal with security. So in Somalia, the issue was Al-Shabaab has a big presence, and the formal state is clearly not capable. But Al-Shabaab taxes these businesses massively. Okay. And so there's a need to also sort of offset these different actors. And so when I spoke to these businesses, they would say like, they would literally talk about it as like two different state building projects. They're like, hey, we're hedging. Yeah. We don't know who's going to win, but we need to support both at this point. And sometimes it turns out that you can support the federal state because it is a bit weak and it can't really enforce a lot of compliance. So maybe supporting that might be good in the long run versus having Al-Shabaab, which is highly extortionary and has great enforcement capacity. So so these are some of the returns that they were talking about. Yeah.
I think that's cool though, because you're getting also into this topic of the episode of what tax relations can kind of tell us about the relationship between different actors in society and the state authority. Do you have any more insights into that discussion from your field experience in Somalia?
Yeah, and I think that, I was actually going to just pick up on what Viljar was saying earlier, this idea also of these different revenue bargains that we have. And it's kind of important to think of them as different revenue bargains. So if we break up this idea of this, okay, let's say there's no macro social contract, but there's revenue bargaining that's happening, right? So these, like he was talking about, the property tax. So people are deciding, okay, I'll trust you, I'll pay a little now, and maybe we'll see how this works out. So that's the level of the bargaining. And I think when we think of tax, the contract model is so persuasive, and it's just because it's so easy and it's really great and it's so intuitive. But actually it's really complicated because each tax has kind of a different bargain behind it. People expect differently. So sometimes with property tax, people expect more returns. Other times people interpret property taxes within this larger context of how much property taxes, let's say, they're paying to their local government. So central taxes will be interpreted in context of local government and sometimes with informal authority. So each tax, in my understanding, has very different rationales. And these also differ according to taxpayers. So businesses, for instance, are interested in profitability, but they're also, in my experience, interested in upholding a certain reputation. So reputational risks also matter. And especially in Somalia, they began to matter a little bit because these were businesses who had done very well in a country that had suffered massively. And everyday Somalis, 64% of the country is below the poverty line. I think it's now gone up. It's improved to 54%. But these businesses couldn't really just be like, we're going to just sit back, not do anything, and this is going to be cool. But actually they did do a lot, and they do a lot of CSR work. And just to complicate the situation even further, they also argue that they should pay less taxes because they do all the CSR work, which is a lot of companies also do worldwide. So it's not
then you
different.
mean that the companies are taking social responsibility, like interacting with the community that they're in?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So their relationship to the state is actually mediated through the community. So yeah, that could be another way. So yeah, I guess what I'm trying to say is like each tax, very different rationales, different bargains go into it, depending specifically, as political settlement scholars have told us, who's doing the bargaining, who's a revenue provider, what level of state we're talking about, what is a bigger context of which other authorities are operating. And yeah, so these are some of the ideas that I think we need to bear in mind when we're talking about this and really start complicating it, even though it's so nice to have the social contract as a frame.
But I think that's... Do you want to say something?
Yeah. Can I come in quickly? I thought about this, that you have many different bargains between the state and many different actors. And I remember from when I did fieldwork in Mali, it's not only something you see between the larger formal businesses and the state, but you also find it down in the large informal sectors of these types of countries that usually have. Mali, very large informal sector also. We spoke a lot with a few different informal sector associations that group to where different retailers, shop owners were organized, and they bargain with the local tax authority and the mayor to reduce their taxes and to improve their conditions for running businesses. It's not an easy bargaining environment. They could make deals, and then the mayor one of the mayors in Bamako, in the capital of Mali, could just renege on the deal later and said, I don't remember any deal. So it's difficult, and members within the associations, they would usually promise that, okay, we're going to pay all our taxes, we're not going to pay bribes, and then some members would still pay bribes to lower their own tax bills. But several associations, informal sector, sometimes in the literature they're treated as they're not paying taxes, but they usually do, as long as they're within the reach of tax authorities, pay a loads of different taxes and fees and levies, and there's a lot of bargaining that goes on at the local level around there. So
that's very interesting. I think we're going to round up here, and I think it was a perfect ending because you both really showed how there's so much more nuance to this kind of traditional theories of fiscal social contract when you go into the nitty-gritty, when you look at informal networks, when you look at patronage networks in the field. And all of that is kind of what we're going to continue to explore in the conference that we're hosting in 2-3 weeks from when we're recording. So the 22nd, 23rd of October will be the main conference. And you guys will be in a panel about taxation in fragile states. So I'm very much looking forward to that. And I hope we can continue this conversation both there and in other forums. And thank you so much for coming today.
Thank you for the conversation.
Thank you so much. Yeah, this has been great.